The feudal world of Colchis, with its ancient temples and dust-swept plains, bore little resemblance to the technological marvels of Terra. Its society was dominated by a powerful religious organization known as the Covenant, whose temples dotted the landscape and whose priests held sway over the largely agrarian population. It was into this world that the Primarch pod containing Lorgar crashed, an event that would forever alter the destiny of Colchis and eventually shake the foundations of the Imperium itself. Unlike many of his brother Primarchs who landed on hostile worlds where survival demanded immediate strength, Lorgar's arrival on Colchis was marked by an almost prophetic reverence. Local accounts describe a child of gold descending from the heavens in a blaze of light, fulfilling ancient Colchian prophecies about the arrival of a messianic figure. This child, with skin that seemed to shimmer with a faint golden hue and eyes that held wisdom beyond mortal comprehension, was discovered by travelers who brought him to the attention of the Covenant's religious authorities. Corferon, a high-ranking and particularly zealous priest of the Covenant, recognized something extraordinary in the child. Though physically an adult man of advancing years, Corferon possessed the cunning and ambition that had allowed him to rise through the Covenant's hierarchy. He claimed guardianship of the Golden Child, naming him Lorgar. Some historical texts suggest that Corferon may have initially seen the child as a tool to advance his own standing within the Covenant, but whatever his initial motivations, his relationship with Lorgar would prove complex and enduring. Under Corferon's strict tutelage, Lorgar was immersed in the teachings of the Covenant. The religion centered around the worship of entities they called the Old Faith, and prophecies of a coming savior who would lead the faithful to salvation. Lorgar absorbed these teachings with remarkable speed, his transhuman intellect allowing him to memorize entire religious texts after a single reading. By the time he had reached what appeared to be adolescence, though Primarchs matured at rates incomparable to normal humans, Lorgar had not only mastered the Covenant's dogma, but had begun to reinterpret it in ways that both impressed and alarmed the priesthood. Lorgar's physical development, while impressive by human standards, was less pronounced than many of his Primarch brothers. Where some Primarchs like Angron or Lemon Russ were built for direct combat, Lorgar's form seemed crafted for a different purpose. He grew tall and broad-shouldered, but with a face of such perfect symmetry and expressive features that those who gazed upon him often found themselves entranced. His voice, perhaps his most powerful natural weapon, could modulate from a whisper that could be heard across a silent chamber to a thunderous declaration that could stir thousands to action. It was during his early manhood that Lorgar's latent psychic abilities began to manifest. Unlike the raw destructive potential displayed by Magnus or the foresight of Sanguinius, Lorgar's psychic talents expressed themselves more subtly. He experienced visions, fragmented glimpses of a golden figure leading humanity to greatness among the stars. These visions, combined with his study of ancient Colchian texts, led Lorgar to a profound revelation. The savior prophesied in the Covenant's teachings was coming, and Lorgar was destined to prepare the way. This revelation marked the beginning of what Colchian historians would later call the Pilgrimage, though in truth, it was a holy war. Lorgar began to preach a new interpretation of the Covenant's teachings, declaring that the prophesied savior was a golden being who would arrive from beyond the stars to lead humanity to its rightful place in the galaxy. His oratory was spellbinding, his logic flawless, and his conviction absolute. Thousands flocked to hear him speak, and many who came as skeptics left as devoted followers. Corferon, recognizing the power of Lorgar's message and his undeniable charisma, positioned himself as the Primarch's chief advisor and interpreter. He helped organize Lorgar's growing followers into a disciplined religious army, the Warriors of the Word. Together, they began a campaign to bring all of Colchis under the banner of what Lorgar now called the Coming of the Emperor. The campaign was not without bloodshed. The established Covenant authorities, seeing Lorgar's teachings as heretical, resisted violently. Temple cities became battlegrounds as the Warriors of the Word clashed with Covenant defenders. Lorgar himself led many of these battles, and while he lacked the martial prowess of some of his brother Primarchs, his presence on the battlefield was no less impactful. He fought with a golden maul that, according to legend, he had crafted himself, and his psychic abilities allowed him to inspire supernatural courage in his followers while sowing doubt and fear in his enemies. One by one, the temple cities fell. Lorgar's conquest was not merely military. After each victory, he would address the conquered populace, explaining his vision with such eloquence and passion that many former enemies became devoted followers. Those who continued to resist were given a choice: acceptance or exile. Lorgar rarely ordered executions, preferring to win converts through persuasion rather than fear, though Corferon was less merciful in his enforcement of Lorgar's will. Within a decade, all of Colchis worshipped according to Lorgar's teachings. Temples were rebuilt or repurposed to reflect the new doctrine, and the population prepared for the coming of their savior. Lorgar himself spent much of this time in contemplation and writing, producing texts that would later form the core of the Lectitio Divinitatis, the foundational document of what would eventually become the imperial cult. The arrival of the emperor on Colchis was, to Lorgar, the fulfillment of his most profound beliefs. Historical records describe their meeting as one of the most unique among all Primarch reunifications. Where some Primarchs met their Gene Father with suspicion, defiance, or calculated acceptance, Lorgar immediately knelt before the master of mankind. To the Primarch, this was not merely a meeting with a biological progenitor, but the long-awaited encounter with the divine being he had prophesied. The Emperor, resplendent in golden armor and accompanied by a retinue of custodians, accepted Lorgar's devotion with outward grace but inward concern. The master of mankind's vision for humanity explicitly rejected religion and superstition in favor of rational, scientific understanding, the doctrine known as the imperial truth. Here was his son, clearly gifted with extraordinary charisma and leadership, who had built his entire identity around religious devotion. Nevertheless, the emperor formally recognized Lorgar as Primarch of the 17th Legion, the word-bearers, formerly known as the Imperial Heralds. The Legion had been created from Lorgar's gene seed and had already established a reputation for zealous compliance with imperial directives. The reunion between Primarch and Legion was characterized by immediate mutual devotion. The Astartes of the 17th saw in Lorgar the embodiment of their own dedication to the imperial cause, while Lorgar saw in them the perfect instruments to spread what he believed was the Emperor's divine will. Corferon, despite being too old for the full Astartes transformation process, underwent a modified procedure that granted him some of the enhancements of a space marine. He became Lorgar's first captain and chief advisor, a position that allowed him to maintain his influence over the Primarch, and by extension, the entire Legion. Alongside him rose Erebus, a Colchian priest who had been among the first to join Lorgar's cause and who would become the Legion's first chaplain. The integration of Colchian culture and beliefs into the 17th Legion was swift and comprehensive. Warriors of the Word who met the genetic requirements were inducted into the Legion, bringing with them their religious fervor. The Legion's name was officially changed to the Word-bearers, reflecting their new mission as Lorgar saw it, to spread the word of the Emperor throughout the galaxy. This period marked the beginning of a profound internal conflict for Lorgar. The Emperor had made it clear that he was not divine and that the imperial truth rejected all forms of religious worship. Yet Lorgar's entire worldview, the foundation of his identity and purpose, was built around the divinity of the Emperor. This cognitive dissonance created a wound in Lorgar's psyche that would never truly heal. Outwardly, Lorgar accepted the imperial truth. He led his legion in the Great Crusade, bringing world after world into compliance with apparent dedication to the Emperor's secular vision. But privately, he struggled to reconcile his faith with the Emperor's commands. This struggle was evident in how the word-bearers conducted their campaigns. They did not merely conquer, but converted, building temples and monuments to the Emperor on every world they brought to compliance, teaching the populations to revere the master of mankind as a god despite his explicit rejection of such worship. Lorgar's psychic abilities continued to develop during this period, though he was reluctant to fully embrace them. Unlike Magnus, who delved deeply into the nature of the warp and psychic phenomena, Lorgar approached his abilities with caution, perhaps fearing that they might further complicate his already conflicted relationship with the Emperor's teachings. Nevertheless, these abilities enhanced his already formidable oratorical talents, allowing him to connect with audiences on an almost supernatural level. The Primarch's speeches could hold thousands in rapt attention for hours. His words seemed to resonate not just with the ears, but with the hearts and minds of his listeners. Some witnesses described feeling as though Lorgar was speaking directly to them, addressing their deepest hopes and fears, even in the midst of a massive gathering. This gift made him uniquely effective at bringing worlds into compliance through persuasion rather than force, though the word-bearers were fully capable of devastating military action when required. Lorgar's talents extended beyond the spoken word. He was a prolific writer, producing theological texts, philosophical treatises, and even poetry that explored the nature of humanity's place in the cosmos. His work, the Urizen, a collection of meditations on order and purpose, was studied even by his brother Primarchs, some of whom, particularly Guilliman, found his tendency toward abstraction and metaphysics frustrating, but his insights occasionally profound. This period of Lorgar's life was characterized by outward success but inner turmoil. The word-bearer's compliance record was impressive, with dozens of worlds brought into the imperial fold with minimal bloodshed. Yet each world was left not merely compliant but worshipful, their populations indoctrinated into what was essentially a cult of the emperor, despite the official policy of secular rationalism. The emperor was aware of this discrepancy, but initially allowed it to continue, perhaps hoping that Lorgar would eventually embrace the imperial truth of his own accord, or perhaps because the worlds left by the word-bearers, while ideologically problematic, were stable and productive additions to the Imperium. This tacit acceptance would not last forever, and the reckoning, when it came, would shatter Lorgar's world and set him on a path that would ultimately threaten the very foundation of the Imperium he so fervently served. For nearly 50 years, Lorgar led the word-bearers through the Great Crusade with religious fervor disguised as imperial zeal. While other legions conquered and moved on, the word-bearers lingered on each world they brought to compliance, building grand cathedrals, erecting massive statues of the emperor, and instructing the populace in elaborate rituals of devotion. What the 17th Legion lacked in conquest speed, they made up for in thoroughness. Each world they left behind was utterly devoted to the emperor, not merely as a leader, but as a god. The emperor's patience with this state of affairs was not infinite. While the Imperium benefited from the stability of word-bearer-compliant worlds, the slow pace of their conquests and their flagrant disregard for the imperial truth became increasingly problematic as the Great Crusade expanded. The word-bearers' compliance rate fell to the lowest among all legions, with Lorgar's forces spending sometimes years on a single world perfecting its conversion to the imperial cult. On the dusty world of Kur, in the region designated 41-7, stood Monarchia, the perfect city. Built by the word-bearers after bringing Kur to compliance, Monarchia represented the pinnacle of Lorgar's vision for humanity under the Emperor's rule. Its gleaming spires and golden domes housed millions of citizens, all of whom began and ended each day with prayers to the God Emperor. Massive statues lined the avenues, each depicting the master of mankind in various aspects of divinity. The city's central plaza featured a temple so vast that 50,000 worshippers could gather within its main chamber, while the acoustics were so perfectly designed that even a whispered prayer from the high altar could be heard in the furthest corners. For Lorgar, Monarchia was proof that his interpretation of the Great Crusade was correct, that bringing the light of the Emperor to humanity meant teaching them to worship him properly. The city stood as a testament to the word-bearer's dedication and Lorgar's vision of a galaxy united in faith. The Emperor's response was as swift as it was brutal. Without warning, a fleet bearing the insignia of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, translated into the Kur system. Their commander, Primarch Guilliman, delivered a terse message to the planetary authorities. Monarchia was to be evacuated completely within 6 days. No explanation was given, no justification offered. The citizens of the perfect city, confused and frightened, were herded onto massive transports and relocated to refugee camps outside the city limits. When the evacuation was complete, the Ultramarines descended upon Monarchia. With cold efficiency, they planted demolition charges throughout the city's structures. Temples, administrative buildings, hab blocks, and monuments, nothing was spared. At precisely the designated hour, the charges detonated in a carefully orchestrated sequence, reducing the perfect city to rubble in less than 30 minutes. The Ultramarines then deployed their heavy machinery, grinding the rubble to dust until nothing remained of Monarchia but a flattened plain of gray ash. The Word-Bearers' fleet, responding to distress calls from Kerr, arrived 3 days later. Lorgar, aboard his flagship Fidelitas Lex, was initially bewildered by reports that the Ultramarines had destroyed Monarchia. Relations between the Primarchs had always been complex, but outright sabotage of another legion's work was unprecedented. As the Word-Bearers' ships entered orbit, they received a simple command. The 17th Legion was to assemble on the surface at the site where Monarchia had stood. Lorgar led his legion to the designated coordinates, where they found only a vast field of ash stretching to the horizon. Of the perfect city, nothing remained. As the Word-Bearers stood in stunned silence, a massive golden vessel descended from orbit, the Bucephalus, the Emperor's own flagship. Alongside it came ships bearing the distinctive markings of the Ultramarines. What followed was perhaps the most profound public humiliation any Primarch would endure during the Great Crusade. The Emperor, accompanied by Malcador the Sigillite and a contingent of golden-armored custodians, confronted Lorgar on the ashes of Monarchia. Guilliman and his Ultramarines formed a ring around the assembled Word-Bearers, bolters at the ready. The Emperor's rebuke was delivered not in anger, but with cold disappointment. He condemned Lorgar's slow pace of conquest, pointing out that the 17th Legion had brought fewer worlds into compliance than any other legion despite having operated for over a century. But far more damning was his rejection of Lorgar's devotion. The Emperor explicitly denied his divinity, rejected the worship Lorgar had fostered, and declared the Word-Bearers' practice of building temples and converting populations to be in direct contravention of the imperial truth. As the Emperor spoke, his psychic might press down upon the assembled Word-Bearers. Lorgar felt the weight of his father's disappointment like a physical force, driving him to his knees. Around him, his legion, 10,000 transhuman warriors, were similarly forced to kneel in the ashes of their greatest achievement. The Ultramarines remained standing, silent witnesses to the humiliation of their brother legion. The Emperor demanded that Lorgar and his Word-Bearers renounce their false beliefs and embrace the imperial truth, that they become true crusaders rather than missionaries. He made it clear that further deviation would not be tolerated. Then, without allowing Lorgar to speak in his defense, the Emperor departed, leaving the 17th Legion kneeling in the dust of their shattered faith. The psychological impact of this rebuke on Lorgar cannot be overstated. For a being engineered to be physically and mentally superior to ordinary humans, the Primarch displayed a very human response to this trauma. Witnesses describe how Lorgar remained kneeling long after the Emperor had departed, his golden features streaked with tears, his massive form trembling not with rage but with grief. For Lorgar, the destruction of Monarchia and the Emperor's rejection represented more than a tactical setback or political embarrassment. It was the shattering of his entire worldview, a fundamental crisis of identity. Since his earliest memories on Colchis, Lorgar had defined himself through faith. His purpose had been to prepare the way for the Emperor, whom he saw as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. When reunited with his Gene father, he had seamlessly transferred his religious devotion to the Emperor, seeing the Great Crusade as a holy mission to unite humanity under the God Emperor's divine rule. Now, that foundation was torn away. The Emperor had not merely rejected worship, he had rejected Lorgar's entire purpose. The Primarch who had once been so certain of his path now found himself adrift, his most fundamental beliefs denounced as false by the very being those beliefs centered upon. The immediate aftermath of Monarchia saw Lorgar withdraw into seclusion aboard the Fidelitas Lex. For nearly a month, he refused all visitors save for Corferon and Erebus. The Word-Bearers' Legion, mirroring their Primarch's crisis, fell into disarray. Some officers advocated immediate compliance with the Emperor's demands, suggesting the Legion strip all religious iconography from their armor and vessels. Others, particularly those from Colchis, resisted such changes, arguing that faith had always been the Legion's strength. During this period of isolation, Lorgar's closest advisors played crucial roles in shaping his response to the crisis. Corferon, who had raised Lorgar from infancy, provided a connection to his past on Colchis, reminding him of the prophecies and beliefs that had guided him before the emperor's arrival. Erebus, the first chaplain, offered a different perspective, suggesting that perhaps the emperor's rejection was itself a test of faith, or possibly an indication that Lorgar had been worshipping the wrong deity. When Lorgar finally emerged from seclusion, he announced a dramatic course of action. The word-bearers would embark on what he termed a pilgrimage of enlightenment, a journey to discover the true nature of divinity in the universe. If the emperor rejected godhood, then perhaps there were other powers in the cosmos worthy of devotion. This pilgrimage would be led by Lorgar himself aboard the Lex Talionis, a vessel specially equipped for deep void exploration. Publicly, the word-bearers presented this pilgrimage as a period of reflection and reorganization, an effort to bring their methods in line with the emperor's wishes. In reality, it marked the beginning of the Legion's turn toward darker powers. Corpheron and Erebus, who had secretly harbored knowledge of entities beyond imperial understanding, guided Lorgar towards specific coordinates in the galactic northwest, where the boundaries between real space and the warp grew thin. The Lex Talionis, accompanied by a small fleet of word-bearers vessels, journeyed for months through increasingly turbulent warp space. Navigation became difficult as they approached what Imperial charts marked as a permanent warp storm, the region that would later be known as the Eye of Terror. Rather than avoid this treacherous area, Lorgar ordered the fleet to press onward, driven by visions and dreams that grew more intense as they neared their destination. The exact events that transpired when the word-bearers entered the fringes of the Eye remain obscured in contradictory accounts and deliberate misinformation. What is clear is that Lorgar experienced direct contact with entities that called themselves the Primordial Truth, the Four Chaos Gods. Unlike his brother Magnus, who had approached the warp with scholarly curiosity, Lorgar encountered these entities as a supplicant seeking meaning. The Chaos Gods, recognizing a potential convert of immense value, presented themselves not as destroyers, but as the true divine powers of the universe, entities that, unlike the Emperor, acknowledged and welcomed worship. For 7 months, Lorgar remained within the Eye, communing with these entities and learning their nature. The experience transformed him physically as well as spiritually. His once golden skin took on a pallor that seemed to shift subtly in different lights, and his eyes gained a faint luminescence visible in darkness. More profound were the changes to his psychic abilities, which expanded dramatically as he embraced the power offered by the Chaos Gods. When the Lex Talionis finally emerged from the Eye, Lorgar was a changed being. He returned with what he called the Primordial Truth, the revelation that the universe was not the rational material realm described by the Imperial Truth, but rather a place where emotion and belief shaped reality. The warp, he now understood, was not merely an alternate dimension useful for faster-than-light travel, but the realm of gods born from and sustained by the collective psyche of sentient beings. Most significantly, Lorgar returned with a new purpose. If the Emperor rejected godhood and denied the divine nature of the universe, then he was either deluded or deliberately misleading humanity. Either way, the Imperial project as currently constituted was fundamentally flawed. Humanity would never reach its true potential following the Emperor's path. A new direction was needed, one that acknowledged the primordial truth and prepared humanity for its rightful place in a universe ruled by the Chaos Gods. The Word-Bearers' Legion gradually transformed under this new vision. Outwardly, they appeared to comply with the Emperor's demands, removing obvious religious iconography from their armor and vessels. They increased their pace of conquest, bringing worlds into compliance with newfound efficiency. But beneath this veneer of loyalty, a new faith took root. The Legion's chaplains, under Erebus's guidance, began introducing subtle alterations to Imperial doctrines, preparing the groundwork for a more significant shift. Lorgar himself returned to the Great Crusade with apparent humility and dedication. He met with several of his brother Primarchs, including Horus Lupercal, sharing insights and strategies that seemed to demonstrate his commitment to the Emperor's secular vision. Few recognized the subtle signs of his transformation or understood that his newfound dedication masked a profound betrayal in the making. At the same time, Lorgar began work on a new manuscript, the Book of Lorgar. Unlike his earlier works that had glorified the Emperor, this text subtly introduced concepts aligned with chaos worship, disguised as philosophical explorations of humanity's relationship with the cosmos. Copies of this work circulated among the word-bearers and, through careful distribution by Erebus and his agents, found their way into the hands of influential figures in other legions. The seeds of heresy were being sown throughout the Imperium, and at the center of this corruption stood Lorgar Aurelian, once the most devoted son of the Emperor, now the first Primarch to kneel before the ruinous powers. The humbling at Monarchia, intended to correct Lorgar's misplaced faith, had instead diverted that faith toward entities that would use it to bring the Imperium to the brink of destruction. The ashes of Monarchia proved fertile ground for the seeds of betrayal. Following his return from the Eye of Terror, Lorgar began a methodical and patient corruption of his legion that would span 4 decades, a corruption so subtle and gradual that even the Emperor's most vigilant servants failed to detect it until too late. Lorgar's transformation of the word-bearers began with a restructuring of the legion's hierarchy. The chaplaincy, previously serving as spiritual guides reinforcing devotion to the Emperor, became the primary vehicle for spreading the new faith. Erebus, as first chaplain, oversaw this transformation, carefully selecting those most receptive to the primordial truth for elevation within the core. These chosen chaplains underwent secret rituals in the depths of the Fidelitas Lex, emerging with their minds open to the whispers of the warp and their loyalty transferred from the Emperor to the ruinous powers. The brilliance of Lorgar's corruption lay in its incremental nature. The word-bearers did not suddenly abandon imperial practices or openly embrace chaos. Instead, they adopted a doctrine of dualism, outwardly serving the Imperium while inwardly preparing for its transformation. This approach allowed them to continue participating in the Great Crusade without arousing suspicion, all while spreading their corrupting influence throughout the expanding Imperium. In the 850s of the 30th millennium, approximately 5 years after Monarchia, Lorgar proposed the expansion of the chaplaincy concept to other legions. Presenting it to the Council of Nicaea as a means to maintain discipline and uphold the imperial truth, Lorgar offered word-bearers chaplains to train their counterparts in other legions. Several Primarchs, including Horus, Fulgrim, and Ferrus Manus, accepted this offer, unwittingly allowing agents of chaos direct access to their command structures. These exported chaplains, carefully selected by Erebus, carried with them corrupted versions of Lorgar's writings. These texts, superficially aligned with imperial doctrine, contained subtle philosophical divergences that would gradually erode faith in the Emperor's vision. The most dangerous of these was the concept that power required worship to reach its full potential, a seemingly innocuous idea that laid the groundwork for accepting the Chaos Gods as necessary recipients of devotion. While the chaplaincy program expanded the word-bearer's influence, Lorgar focused on a more direct form of corruption through his newest manuscript. The Lectitio Divinitatis, ostensibly a philosophical treatise on humanity's place in the cosmos, contained carefully crafted arguments for the Emperor's divinity. This apparent return to his previous beliefs was actually a calculated move. By encouraging worship of the Emperor as a god, Lorgar created a theological framework that could later be subverted toward chaos worship. The dissemination of the Lectitio Divinitatis demonstrated Lorgar's psychological brilliance. Rather than openly distributing the text, word-bearers' agents presented it as forbidden knowledge, sharing it secretly with those who showed disillusionment with the imperial truth. This approach leveraged human psychology. The allure of prohibited information made the text more compelling than if it had been openly preached. Within 20 years, cells of emperor worshippers existed on hundreds of worlds, their faith ironically preparing them for eventual conversion to chaos. The word-bearers' military campaigns during this period served their corrupting agenda. When bringing worlds into compliance, they would identify populations with strong religious tendencies. Rather than eradicating these beliefs as other legions might, they would subtly redirect them, preserving religious structures but replacing local deities with the emperor. Then, after imperial authorities had moved on, word-bearers' agents would remain behind, gradually introducing elements of chaos worship disguised as deeper mysteries of the imperial cult. By the 870s, Lorgar had established a shadow empire within the Imperium, a network of cults, compromised officials, and corrupted Astartes spanning thousands of worlds. This network allowed the word-bearers to coordinate their corruption efforts across vast distances, creating a foundation for the heresy to come. More importantly, it provided channels through which demonic entities could influence the material realm, weakening the barriers between real space and the warp in preparation for larger incursions. The corruption of the word-bearers themselves progressed through carefully delineated stages. Initiates were first exposed to the Lectitio Divinitatis, cultivating religious devotion to the emperor that contradicted the imperial truth. Once this devotion was firmly established, they were gradually introduced to the concept of the deeper truth, the idea that the emperor was merely one manifestation of divine power in the universe. Finally, those who embraced this concept would learn of the primordial truth, the existence of the chaos gods as the true divine powers of the cosmos. Not all word-bearers accepted this new doctrine. A significant minority, especially those recruited from worlds other than Colchis, resisted the turn toward chaos. Lorgar dealt with these loyalists through a series of actions disguised as military necessities. Suspected traditionalists were assigned to dangerous compliance actions with minimal support, sent on exploratory missions into hazardous regions, or seconded to other legions for extended periods. Through these methods, Lorgar purged potential opposition without revealing his true intentions. The most significant test of Lorgar's corrupting influence came in 872, when he orchestrated what imperial records would later call the Pilgrimage of Calth, publicly presented as a joint military exercise between the word-bearers and ultramarines. This gathering on the eastern fringe allowed Lorgar to assess the extent of chaos influence among his legion. The word-bearers performed flawlessly, maintaining their facade of loyalty while secretly conducting rituals that left psychic markers across the Calth system, markers that would later facilitate warp disturbances during the opening phases of the Horus Heresy. By 890, Lorgar's corruption of his legion was nearly complete. The majority of word-bearers now secretly worshipped the chaos gods, their armor bearing hidden symbols of devotion beneath the surface iconography. Ritual scarification became common, though kept in locations easily concealed by armor. The Legion's recruitment practices shifted to favor candidates with latent psychic abilities, creating a force increasingly attuned to warp energies. Even their weapons underwent subtle modifications, with blessed oils and inscribed runes enhancing their lethality against those loyal to the Emperor. Throughout this transformation, Lorgar maintained a careful public persona. He attended council meetings, participated in joint military actions with other legions, and even hosted the Emperor aboard the Fidelitas Lex during a review of Crusade progress in 897. His apparent acceptance of the imperial truth and renewed dedication to the Crusade earned him reconciliation with several brother Primarchs who had previously kept their distance following Monarchia. This rehabilitation allowed Lorgar to extend his corrupting influence to his brothers. He cultivated particularly close relationships with Horus, Fulgrim, and Angron, Primarchs whose personalities or circumstances made them vulnerable to chaos influence. With Horus, Lorgar engaged in long philosophical discussions about the future of the Imperium after the Crusade's completion. With Fulgrim, he shared rare texts and artifacts that subtly exposed the Phoenician to warp influences. With Angron, he offered understanding and validation of the Red Angel's rage, presenting the Butcher's Nails as a form of transcendence rather than enslavement. The pivotal moment in Lorgar's grand design came following Horus's appointment as Warmaster in 901. Recognizing both the opportunity this presented and the danger of Horus's loyalty to the Emperor, Lorgar arranged for the fateful mission to Davin, the event that would irrevocably set the heresy in motion. The corruption of Horus began long before his physical wounding on Davin's moon. Lorgar had spent years subtly influencing the Warmaster, exploiting Horus's growing concerns about the Emperor's return to Terra and the introduction of civilian administrators to the governance of conquered worlds. Through carefully chosen words and selective information, Lorgar nurtured Horus's fear that the Astartes would be discarded once the Crusade ended, that the Emperor viewed his sons as tools rather than heirs. When the 63rd Expedition Fleet approached the Davin system in 902, everything had been prepared. The anatheme blade, a warp-touched weapon of incredible potency, had been placed in the hands of Eugen Temba, the corrupted imperial commander of Davin. Lorgar had personally overseen the blade's consecration in a ritual aboard the Fidelitas Lex, binding it to a powerful demon that would ensure any wound it inflicted would resist even Astartes' healing. The events on Davin's moon proceeded according to Lorgar's design. Horus, confronting the corrupted Temba, suffered a wound from the anatheme that conventional medicine could not heal. As the War Master lay dying, Erebus, who had integrated himself into Horus's inner circle, suggested a local healing ritual as the only hope for salvation. This ritual, in reality a carefully constructed warp ceremony, transported Horus's consciousness to a realm between reality and the warp where Erebus, disguised as the loyal Primarch Haster Sejanus, showed him visions of a future where the Emperor was worshipped as a god while the Primarchs were forgotten. These visions, crafted by Lorgar based on his understanding of Horus's deepest fears, broke the War Master's loyalty to the Emperor. When Horus emerged from the healing ritual, he was irrevocably committed to opposing the Emperor's plans for humanity. The greatest triumph of Lorgar's manipulation was that Horus believed the decision was entirely his own, that he was acting to save humanity rather than serving the Chaos Gods. With Horus turned, Lorgar's decades of preparation began to bear fruit. The network of cults, corrupted officials, and compromised Astartes he had established provided the War Master with intelligence, resources, and hidden allies across the Imperium. The chaplains he had placed in other legions became vectors for spreading corruption, identifying potential converts, and eliminating those whose loyalty couldn't be swayed. Perhaps most significantly, the Lectitio Divinitatis, Lorgar's theological justification for emperor worship, had spread far beyond his control, taking root in the civilian populations of hundreds of worlds. This growing religious movement would eventually evolve into the imperial cult, the state religion of the Imperium that emerged after the heresy. In the ultimate irony, the very document Lorgar had created to undermine the Emperor's vision became the foundation for his worship as a god, a development that would have horrified the master of mankind. In the final years before the outbreak of open hostilities, Lorgar focused on strengthening the position of those legions aligned with Horus while weakening potential opposition. Through his agents, he arranged for the loyal legions to be deployed to distant corners of the galaxy, far from Terra and from each other. Meanwhile, he ensured that corrupted forces were positioned near strategically valuable targets and lines of communication. This careful maneuvering would maximize the impact of the War Master's eventual betrayal, allowing the traitor forces to seize initiative across multiple sectors simultaneously. The culmination of Lorgar's preparations came at Istvan III, where Horus purged the loyalist elements from the corrupted legions. The word-bearers contributed to this action not through direct participation, but through intelligence that identified those Astartes whose loyalty to the Emperor couldn't be broken. This information allowed Horus to select the perfect units for the surface deployment, ensuring that the subsequent virus bombing would eliminate potential internal resistance while strengthening the resolve of those who participated in the betrayal. As the galaxy ignited in the flames of civil war, Lorgar finally revealed his true nature. The word-bearers cast aside their pretense of loyalty, displaying the symbols of chaos openly on their armor and vessels. Their weapons, long blessed in secret rituals, flared with warp energy as they turned against their former brothers. The corruption that had festered beneath the surface for 40 years erupted in an orgy of violence as the 17th Legion embraced their role as the first true servants of chaos among the Astartes. Lorgar's tactical acumen during the Horus Heresy revealed a mind as calculating as it was charismatic. While never considered among the foremost battlefield commanders of the Primarchs, his true genius lay in strategic manipulation and the orchestration of galaxy-spanning corruption. This became devastatingly apparent during the Calth atrocity in the early days of the heresy. The assault on Calth represented Lorgar's vengeance against the Ultramarines for their role in the destruction of Monarchia, but it served a far greater purpose in the grand design of the heresy. Under the pretense of a joint muster to prepare for a campaign against the Orcs in the Viridian system, Lorgar positioned 50,000 word-bearers alongside the unsuspecting Ultramarines. The true objective was twofold: to cripple the 13th Legion and to create a massive warp storm through ritual sacrifice that would isolate Ultramar from the wider Imperium. Lorgar entrusted operational command to his most devoted son, First Chaplain Erebus, and his bitter brother Cor Ferron, while he prepared for an even more significant campaign elsewhere. The attack began with sabotage of Calth's orbital defense grid, followed by a void ambush that caught the Ultramarines' fleet in disarray. As battles erupted across the planet's surface and in orbit, Word-Bearers' chaplains activated ritual sites established years earlier during the so-called Pilgrimage of Calth. The scale of the betrayal was unprecedented. Word-Bearers' forces had secreted demon-infused devices throughout Calth's infrastructure, corrupted civilian populations into sleeper cultists, and positioned specialized units to target communication hubs. When activated, these elements created a cascading system failure that left Ultramarine forces fragmented and unable to coordinate their defense. Most devastating was the destruction of Calth's primary star. Word-Bearers' ships executed a complex maneuver that destabilized the star's corona, causing a massive radiation surge that killed millions of unprotected civilians and forced the surviving population underground. This act transformed Calth from a verdant agri-world into a radiation-scorched wasteland, while simultaneously providing the massive death toll needed to fuel the planned warp ritual. The true purpose of the Calth atrocity became clear when Cor Ferron activated the final phase of the ritual. The deaths of millions, combined with the psychic trauma of Astartes killing their brothers, tore a wound in reality that birthed the massive warp storm known as the Ruin Storm. This immense disturbance cut Ultramar off from Terra, preventing the Ultramarines from reinforcing the Imperial Palace during the final battles of the Heresy. While the Ultramarines eventually drove the Word-Bearers from Calth, the strategic victory belonged to Lorgar. The 13th Legion had suffered devastating casualties, losing almost a quarter of their strength. More importantly, they were now trapped in Ultramar, unable to influence events elsewhere in the Imperium as the Heresy unfolded. Concurrent with the Calth campaign, Lorgar himself embarked on what Imperial historians would later call the Shadow Crusade. This campaign, conducted alongside his brother Angron and the World Eaters Legion, targeted the 500 worlds of Ultramar, systematically destroying Guilliman's realm while the Ultramarines' Primarch was trapped fighting on Calth. The Shadow Crusade demonstrated Lorgar's tactical flexibility. Rather than engaging in protracted battles for key worlds, Word-Bearers' forces conducted rapid strikes against civilian infrastructure, agricultural centers, and industrial complexes. This approach maximized economic damage while minimizing Astartes' casualties, effectively crippling Ultramar's ability to support the wider Imperium during the Heresy. More revealing was Lorgar's relationship with Angron during this campaign. Recognizing that the Red Angel's deteriorating mental state threatened his usefulness to the Heresy, Lorgar implemented a plan to transform his brother. On the world of Nuceria, Angron's homeworld, Lorgar orchestrated a ritual that would elevate the World Eater's Primarch to demonhood. The ritual on Nuceria showcased Lorgar's growing mastery of warp sorcery. As Angron fought at the site of his greatest defeat centuries earlier, Lorgar conducted an 8-fold ritual that channeled the power of Khorne into his brother's form. The process required precise timing and immense psychic control, demonstrating how far Lorgar's abilities had developed since his first contact with the Chaos powers. The transformation of Angron achieved multiple objectives. It preserved the World Eater's Primarch's utility to the traitor cause by halting the deterioration caused by the Butcher's nails. It bound Angron permanently to the service of Khorne, securing the World Eater's allegiance to Chaos. Perhaps most significantly, it demonstrated to the other traitor Primarchs the rewards available to those who fully embraced the ruinous powers. Throughout the Heresy, Lorgar's most enduring weapon proved to be his writings, particularly the infamous Book of Lorgar. This text, composed during the decades between Monarchia and the outbreak of the Heresy, served as the foundational document for organized chaos worship within the Imperium. Unlike his earlier Lectitio Divinitatis, which promoted emperor worship, the Book of Lorgar presented a comprehensive theological framework for the veneration of the Chaos gods. The text's structure revealed Lorgar's psychological insight. It began with philosophical arguments that undermined the imperial truth, questioning the emperor's secular vision by highlighting the demonstrable existence of entities within the warp. It then introduced the concept of the four powers as fundamental cosmic forces representing different aspects of sentient experience, Khorne embodying martial pride and courage, Tzeentch representing intellectual ambition and hope for change, Nurgle encompassing endurance and the natural cycle of decay and rebirth, and Slaanesh reflecting the pursuit of perfection and sensory fulfillment. Only after establishing this seemingly reasonable foundation did the text introduce more corrupting concepts, the necessity of sacrifice, the use of blood rituals to commune with these powers, and the transformation of the physical form as the ultimate expression of devotion. This gradual progression allowed readers to accept increasingly heretical ideas, each step seeming a logical extension of the previous one. The Book of Lorgar included detailed instructions for ritual practices, including specific configurations of ritual spaces, formulations of incense and unguents, and phonetic transcriptions of demonic languages for invocations. These practical elements made the text particularly dangerous, as it provided even untrained cultists with effective methods for contacting warp entities. Distribution of the Book of Lorgar during the heresy followed a careful pattern. Wordbearers' chaplains carried master copies, from which selections were transcribed based on the recipient's readiness for corruption. Complete versions were reserved for those already fully committed to chaos, while potential converts received carefully edited portions that emphasized aspects of chaos worship, most likely to appeal to their particular psychology. The text's influence extended far beyond the heresy era. In the fragmented imperium of the 41st millennium, copies and derivatives of the Book of Lorgar continue to circulate among heretical cults. Inquisitorial reports indicate that many cult uprisings across the galaxy can be traced to the discovery of fragments from this text, with each new translation spawning fresh outbreaks of demonic activity. The Ordo Malleus maintains a heavily warded vault within the Inquisitorial fortress on Titan containing captured copies of the Book of Lorgar. Even after 10,000 years, the psychic resonance of these texts remains potent enough to require constant vigilance, with reports of guards experiencing vivid hallucinations and hearing whispers in unknown languages, despite multiple layers of psychic shielding. Lorgar's physical and psychic transformation as he embraced chaos progressed throughout the heresy, reflecting his deepening communion with the ruinous powers. Unlike some of his brothers who dedicated themselves to a single chaos god, Lorgar embraced chaos undivided, allowing all four powers to reshape his form according to their collective will. The early stages of this transformation were subtle, a slight luminescence to his eyes, a faint shimmer beneath his skin when he spoke of the primordial truth, and a resonant quality to his voice that seemed to echo slightly longer than acoustics should allow. These changes accelerated following the rituals on Calth and Nuceria, as the massive influx of warp energy from these events flowed partially through Lorgar himself. By the midpoint of the heresy, Lorgar's appearance had altered significantly. His once golden skin developed a reddish undertone that pulsed with his heartbeat. The sclera of his eyes darkened to obsidian, while the irises shifted through various colors depending on which aspect of chaos he channeled. His physical stature increased by approximately 15%, with his musculature becoming more defined without sacrificing the proportional harmony that had always characterized his form. Most dramatic were the changes to Lorgar's psychic capabilities. Before Monarchia, his abilities had been relatively modest by Primarch standards, limited to empathic projection that enhanced his charisma and occasional precognitive flashes. As he embraced chaos, these abilities expanded exponentially. He developed powerful telepathic capabilities, able to communicate mentally across vast distances with his senior commanders. His telekinetic powers grew strong enough to deflect bolter fire and tear apart armored vehicles. By the later stages of the heresy, Lorgar could channel warp energy directly, manifesting it as searing beams of multicolored light that could penetrate even Terminator armor. He demonstrated the ability to temporarily enhance his physical capabilities by drawing on the warp, achieving brief periods of speed and strength that rivaled even Sanguinius or Angron. Perhaps most significantly, he developed the ability to perceive and manipulate the connections between the material realm and the warp, allowing him to weaken reality in specific locations to facilitate demonic incursions. These abilities came with visible manifestations. When channeling significant warp energy, Lorgar's skin would develop luminous script that crawled across his surface, passages from his own writings rendered in glowing text that shifted between languages, both human and demonic. His shadow, when cast during these periods of psychic exertion, would not match his physical form, instead displaying a larger shape with suggestions of wings and horn protrusions. The pinnacle of Lorgar's transformation came with his creation of the first true possessed space marines, the Gal Vorbak and later the Anointed. These warriors represented the physical embodiment of Lorgar's theological vision, the perfect union of humanity and the warp. Astartes and Demon merged into a single entity more powerful than either could be separately. The development of the Gal Vorbak began during Lorgar's first journey into the Eye of Terror. 17 word-bearers accompanied their Primarch into the Warp Storm, where they underwent a ritual of demon binding. Unlike later, cruder forms of possession, this process involved a carefully negotiated symbiosis between Astartes and Demon. The word-bearers retained their identities and tactical acumen while gaining access to demonic abilities and resilience. The process transformed these warriors profoundly. In their resting state, the Gal Vorbak appeared as normal Astartes, except for a reddish hue to their skin and a faint acrid odor that surrounded them. When they willed the transformation or experienced intense combat stimuli, their forms would shift dramatically, skin splitting to reveal crimson musculature, bones elongating and reconfiguring, additional limbs or sensory organs manifesting according to the nature of their bound demon. The combat capabilities of these first possessed were extraordinary. They demonstrated remarkable resilience, able to sustain wounds that would kill normal Astartes. Their strength increased dramatically, with recorded instances of Gal Vorbak warriors tearing through tank armor with their bare hands. Most significantly, they retained tactical coordination and discipline even in their transformed state, unlike later possessed who often succumbed to feral bloodlust. Building on the success of the Gal Vorbak, Lorgar later developed the Anointed, a more refined version of the possessed concept. Where the Gal Vorbak represented a somewhat equal partnership between Astartes and Demon, the Anointed were created through a more controlled process that maintained Astartes' dominance over the bound entity. This approach sacrificed some of the raw power of the Gal Vorbak, but produced warriors who could better control their transformations and operate independently for extended periods. The creation of these possessed units demonstrated Lorgar's unique approach to chaos. Where other Primarchs saw demons as servants or allies, Lorgar understood them as aspects of a greater divine presence that could be integrated directly into his followers. This perspective reflected his theological vision, not merely an alliance with chaos, but a fundamental transformation of humanity through union with the warp. The tactical deployment of these units during the heresy revealed Lorgar's strategic insight. Rather than using the Gal Vorbak as shock troops, he deployed them as psychological weapons against loyalist forces. The sight of Astartes transforming into demonic entities shattered enemy morale and challenged the fundamental worldview of loyalist forces, creating cognitive dissonance that undermined their combat effectiveness. At Calth, Gal Vorbak units targeted ultramarine command structures, eliminating leadership while simultaneously demonstrating the power chaos offered to those willing to embrace it. During the Shadow Crusade, they served as Lorgar's personal guards, their presence amplifying the ritual energies he channeled. By the later stages of the heresy, both the Gal Vorbak and the Anointed had become symbols of status within the Word-Bearer's Legion, with ambitious officers competing for the opportunity to undergo the transformation. The legacy of these first possessed extends into the 41st millennium. While the precise rituals used by Lorgar have been lost or corrupted over the millennia, Chaos Space Marine warbands continue to practice possession rituals based on degraded versions of his original work. The resulting possessed lack the stability and control of the original Gal Vorbak, but remain potent weapons in the arsenal of chaos. The Shadow Crusade marked a turning point in Lorgar's transformation from devoted son to architect of galactic ruin. As the Word-Bearers and World Eaters rampaged through Ultramar, Lorgar's conflict with Guilliman took on dimensions beyond mere military confrontation. It became a clash of fundamentally opposed philosophies about humanity's future. Lorgar orchestrated the campaign with calculated precision, targeting not just military assets, but the cultural foundations of Ultramar itself. Where Guilliman had built a realm of order, reason, and civic virtue, Lorgar sought to demonstrate the fragility of such constructs when faced with the raw power of chaos. The Word-Bearers destroyed libraries and academies with the same methodical attention they applied to munitions depots and command centers, understanding that Guilliman's empire was built as much on shared values as on military might. The devastation of Armatura exemplified Lorgar's approach. This fortress world, serving as the military hub for an entire sector of Ultramar, fell to a combined Word-Bearers and World Eaters assault that lasted just 27 hours. Rather than following conventional siege doctrine, Lorgar directed his forces to target the planet's geothermal regulation systems first. The resulting tectonic instability created massive earthquakes that damaged defensive positions from below, while Word-Bearers' drop pods descended from above. When Armatura's command structure finally surrendered, hoping to spare the civilian population, Lorgar ordered a display that revealed how far he had traveled from the compassionate figure who had once sought to convert rather than destroy. The planet's military and civic leadership, some 4,000 individuals, were arranged in a massive 8-pointed star formation in the central plaza of the capital city. At Lorgar's command, the Word-Bearers conducted a ritual slaughter, their blades inscribing specific patterns as they killed, their voices chanting in perfect unison as blood flowed through channels cut into the plaza's marble. The ritual culminated with Lorgar himself ascending to a platform at the center of the formation. Witnesses reported that as he raised his arms, the blood seemed to flow upward, defying gravity to coat his golden armor. The skies above Armatura darkened with unnatural storms, and for 7 minutes, observers throughout the Ultramar system reported seeing a massive 8-pointed star seemingly burned into reality itself, visible even on worlds hundreds of light years distant. This display served multiple purposes. Beyond the immediate psychological impact on Ultramar's population, it further weakened the barriers between real space and the warp throughout the region, contributing to the formation of the Ruin Storm. It also served as a demonstration to the World Eaters, and particularly to Angron, of the power available to those who embraced chaos fully. Lorgar's relationship with Angron during the Shadow Crusade revealed much about his evolving approach to his brother Primarchs. Where once he had sought their approval and acceptance, he now viewed them primarily as pieces to be positioned in the great game of the heresy. Angron, with his deteriorating mental state and the constant pain inflicted by the Butcher's nails, presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The Word-Bearers maintained careful documentation of Angron's condition throughout the campaign. Apothecaries seconded from the 17th Legion monitored the neural degeneration caused by the nails, providing regular reports to Lorgar on the estimated remaining lifespan of the World Eater's Primarch. These reports, recovered from the wreckage of the battle barge Infidus Imperator after the war, reveal that Lorgar knew Angron had less than a decade of effective function remaining. The nails would eventually destroy enough of his brain to render him completely non-functional. This knowledge informed Lorgar's decision to guide Angron to demonhood. The ritual on Nuceria was not a spontaneous action, but the culmination of careful preparation that had begun months earlier. Word-Bearers' forces had secretly visited the world ahead of the main fleet, establishing ritual sites and conducting preliminary sacrifices to prepare the ground. Lorgar had also spent considerable time studying Angron's biological and psychological makeup, determining which of the chaos powers would be most compatible with his brother's nature. The choice of Nuceria as the site for Angron's ascension demonstrated Lorgar's psychological insight. By returning Angron to the world where he had experienced his greatest defeat, where his gladiator family had been slaughtered and he had been forcibly taken by the Emperor, Lorgar created a perfect emotional catalyst. The rage, pain, and sense of betrayal that defined Angron's existence reached their peak on Nuceria, creating an emotional resonance that facilitated the connection between Primarch and Warp Entity. The ritual itself was conducted amidst battle, as Ultramarines' forces led by Guilliman himself attempted to stop what they could sense was a major warp working. Lorgar positioned himself at the center of an 8-pointed star formation nearly 2 kilometers across, formed by Word-Bearer's troops holding position despite heavy casualties. As Angron fought Guilliman directly, Lorgar began a complex incantation in a language that caused bleeding from the ears of unprotected mortals who heard it. The moment of transformation came when Angron, having fought Guilliman to a standstill but suffering severe injuries, fell to his knees in almost the exact spot where his gladiator family had made their last stand centuries earlier. Lorgar completed the final words of his incantation, and reality seemed to fold around Angron's form. Witnesses described a column of blood-red energy erupting from the World Eater's Primarch, reaching into the storm-racked sky. When the energy dissipated, Angron had been transformed. His size doubled, his flesh fused with aspects of his armor, and great wings of braided muscle and bone extending from his back. The newly ascended Demon Primarch's first act was to charge Guilliman with supernatural speed, nearly killing the Ultramarines' Primarch before Lorgar intervened. This intervention surprised many Word-Bearers, who had assumed the ritual's purpose was to eliminate their greatest adversary. In reality, Lorgar's calculations required Guilliman to survive. His continued resistance would occupy significant traitor resources, preventing those forces from being deployed to Terra, while simultaneously ensuring the Ultramarines remained trapped in their home system. The ascension of Angron represented a significant evolution in Lorgar's mastery of warpcraft. Earlier rituals, such as those conducted at Calth and Armatura, had primarily focused on weakening reality or channeling warp energy for specific, temporary effects. The transformation of a Primarch, beings created through the Emperor's unique fusion of material science and warp knowledge, into a Daemon Prince required a far more sophisticated understanding of both warp mechanics and biological transmutation. The knowledge required for such a ritual could not have been developed independently in the short time since Lorgar's turn to chaos. This suggests significant direct tutelage from warp entities, raising questions about what price the Primarch paid for such forbidden knowledge. Certain passages in recovered Word-Bearer's texts hint at sacrifices of self made by Lorgar during his communion with the Chaos Gods, portions of his identity or autonomy surrendered in exchange for arcane secrets. Following Angron's ascension, Lorgar's approach to the Shadow Crusade shifted. Rather than continuing the systematic destruction of Ultramar, he began withdrawing Word-Bearer's forces, leaving the newly demonic Angron and his World Eaters to continue the campaign while he focused on preparation for the approaching siege of Terra. This strategic pivot reflected Lorgar's understanding that the primary objective, isolating the Ultramarines through the creation of the Ruinstorm, had been achieved, making further commitment of resources to the region unnecessary. The confrontation with Corax during this period revealed both Lorgar's growing warp powers and the limitations of his martial abilities compared to his more combat-oriented brothers. As Word-Bearer's forces withdrew from Ultramar, they encountered elements of the Raven Guard conducting guerrilla operations against traitor supply lines. Corax, upon learning of Lorgar's presence, launched a direct assault on the Word-Bearer's command center with a small force of elite troops. The resulting battle demonstrated the combat disparities between the two Primarchs. Corax, even with a significantly reduced legion following the massacre at Istvan V, moved through the Word-Bearer's defenses with lethal efficiency. Witness accounts describe the Raven Guard Primarch as a shadow bringing death, his lightning claws carving through Lorgar's honor guard as if they were unarmored mortals rather than ceramite-clad Astartes. When the two Primarchs finally confronted each other, Lorgar initially attempted to reason with his brother, offering Corax a place in the new order that would emerge after Horus's victory. This approach reflected Lorgar's persistent belief in his own persuasive abilities, a belief that proved unfounded as Corax responded with immediate and overwhelming violence. The combat between them was brutally one-sided. Corax's speed and martial skill far outmatched Lorgar's abilities, and the word-bearer's Primarch quickly found himself on the defensive, suffering multiple serious wounds from his brother's lightning claws. It was only through his newly developed warp abilities that Lorgar managed to survive, creating a barrier of warp energy that temporarily held Corax at bay while he retreated. This defeat had significant psychological impact on Lorgar, reinforcing his understanding that his path to power lay not in direct combat, but in mastery of the warp. In the aftermath, he accelerated his study of chaos lore, focusing particularly on techniques for enhancing his physical form through warp energy. Records from this period show increased ritual activity aboard the Fidelitas Lex, with multiple ceremonies requiring significant blood sacrifice from captive populations. As the heresy progressed toward its climax at Terra, Lorgar's relationship with Horus became increasingly complex. While outwardly supporting the Warmaster's leadership, Lorgar pursued his own agenda, focused on the long-term establishment of chaos worship, rather than merely the defeat of the Emperor. This divergence in objectives created tension between the two Primarchs, particularly regarding the pace of the advance on Terra. Lorgar advocated for a more measured approach that would allow time for ritual preparation of the warp around the solar system, creating conditions more favorable for chaos manifestation during the final battle. Horus, increasingly influenced by the chaos gods and concerned about loyalist reinforcements, pushed for a direct assault as quickly as possible. This strategic disagreement came to a head during the Council of Ullanor, where Lorgar's continued advocacy for delay led to a confrontation with the Warmaster. The exact details of this confrontation remain unclear, as accounts from survivors vary significantly. What is known is that Lorgar left the Council in his flagship and took a significant portion of the word-bearer's legion away from the main traitor force. This apparent rift led many Imperial historians to conclude that Lorgar had been banished by Horus for questioning his authority. More recent scholarship suggests a more nuanced interpretation. Recovered fragments of word-bearer's communication logs indicate that Lorgar's departure may have been a strategic decision agreed upon by both Primarchs, allowing the word-bearers to conduct essential ritual preparations while maintaining the appearance of a rift that would confuse loyalist intelligence. This interpretation is supported by the subsequent activities of the 17th Legion, which focused on establishing warp disturbances along potential loyalist reinforcement routes. Lorgar's contributions to the siege of Terra itself were less direct than those of other traitor Primarchs, but potentially more significant in the long term. While Perturabo designed the physical assault and Mortarion led troops against the walls, Lorgar orchestrated a series of rituals across multiple worlds in the solar system that weakened the barrier between real space and the warp throughout the region. On Titan, a strike force of word-bearers anointed seized control of what would later become the Fortress Monastery of the Grey Knights, conducting a 17-day ritual that saturated the moon with warp energy. Similar operations took place on Venus, Mars, and several of Jupiter's moons, creating a network of warp-touched sites that functioned as a massive ritual circle with Terra at its center. The purpose of this network became clear during the final phase of the siege. As Horus lowered the shields of his battle barge to draw out the Emperor, Lorgar activated the ritual network, creating a temporary state where the warp and real space overlapped throughout much of the solar system. This condition allowed Horus to channel unprecedented levels of chaos energy, elevating him to a state of power that nearly proved sufficient to defeat the Emperor. The failure of Horus and the subsequent retreat of traitor forces marked a turning point in Lorgar's journey. Unlike some traitor Primarchs who fled immediately to the Eye of Terror, Lorgar led the word-bearers on a calculated withdrawal, conducting rear-guard actions that inflicted significant casualties on pursuing loyalist forces while allowing the bulk of his legion to escape intact. During this fighting retreat, Lorgar underwent the final stages of his transformation into a demon Primarch. On the world of Sicarus, at the edge of what would become known as the Eye of Terror, he conducted a ritual utilizing artifacts collected throughout the heresy. Word-bearers' records describe a ceremony lasting 9 days, during which Lorgar recited the entirety of his collected writings from memory, while standing within a circle formed by the bodies of 900 sacrificial victims. On the 9th day, as he spoke the final words of what would become known as the Book of Lorgar, reality tore open above the ritual site. Witnesses described a swirling vortex of energy containing aspects of all four chaos gods: the blood red of Khorne, the iridescent blue of Tzeentch, the sickly green of Nurgle, and the purplish pink of Slaanesh, descending to envelop their Primarch. When the energy dissipated, Lorgar had been transformed. His size had increased dramatically, his golden skin now covered with constantly shifting runes that glowed with inner light. Great wings extended from his back, their surface appearing like parchment covered in microscopic writing that changed constantly. His face retained its perfect symmetry, but now seemed capable of expressing emotions beyond human comprehension. Most significantly, reality itself seemed to bend slightly around him, as if his mere presence was too substantial for the material realm to fully contain. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, as the broken Imperium struggled to rebuild from the ashes of civil war, Lorgar Aurelian made a decision that would puzzle both his followers and enemies for millennia to come. The newly ascended Demon Primarch, rather than leading his legion in continued warfare against the Imperium, chose a path of seclusion and contemplation that would remove him from the galactic stage for nearly 10,000 years. Following the retreat to the Eye of Terror, Lorgar established the Word-Bearer's new homeworld on Sicarus, a demon world where reality bent to the will of its master. There, amid the twisted spires of the Templum Inficio, Lorgar created a sanctuary where he could pursue deeper communion with the Chaos gods and refine his theological understanding of the primordial truth. This massive cathedral fortress, built from black stone that seemed to absorb light, became both the administrative center of the Legion and a site of continuous ritual activity. The decision to withdraw into seclusion came gradually rather than suddenly. For approximately 3 centuries after the heresy, Lorgar remained actively involved in directing Word-Bearer's operations, personally leading several major incursions into Imperial space during the early 31st millennium. Most notable was the desecration of Hadrius, where Lorgar led a force of 7,000 Word-Bearers against an Imperial shrine world, transforming its cathedral complex into a massive warp portal that disgorged demons across 3 sectors before Grey Knight's intervention sealed the breach. By approximately the year 300 of the 31st millennium, however, Lorgar's direct involvement in Legion affairs began to diminish. Word-Bearer's records indicate he spent increasingly longer periods in meditation within the inner sanctum of the Templum Inficio, emerging only to adjudicate major doctrinal disputes or to oversee particularly significant rituals. This gradual withdrawal culminated around the year 500, when Lorgar announced to his Dark Council that he would enter a period of contemplative communion to better understand the will of the gods. What began as a temporary retreat extended into millennia of absence. Lorgar sealed himself within the central chamber of the Templum Inficio, a massive spherical room whose interior surfaces were completely covered with continuously shifting text, the entirety of his theological works constantly rewriting themselves according to his evolving understanding. Only his most trusted lieutenants, Erebus and Corferon, were permitted occasional audience, and even these became increasingly rare as the centuries passed. The nature of Lorgar's contemplation remains largely unknown, though fragments of information have emerged through the testimonies of those few permitted to enter his presence. These accounts describe the Demon Primarch suspended in the center of his sanctum, surrounded by swirling energies that connected him simultaneously to all 4 chaos gods. Visitors reported that Lorgar appeared to exist in multiple states simultaneously, sometimes solid and material, other times ethereal and translucent, occasionally fragmented across multiple locations within the chamber. With their Primarch withdrawn from active leadership, the Word-Bearer's Legion underwent significant restructuring under the guidance of the Dark Council, a ruling body initially headed by First Chaplain Erebus and Dark Apostle Corferon. This council, comprising the most powerful and devoted servants of chaos within the Legion, established a new organizational structure that would define the Word-Bearers for millennia to come. The most significant change was the elevation of the Dark Apostles to positions of supreme authority within the Legion. Where most traitor legions maintained some version of the traditional Astartes command structure, with captains leading companies, the word-bearers reorganized around hosts led by these priest commanders. Each Dark Apostle controlled a host of approximately 1,000 to 2,000 warriors, along with associated cultist forces and demon engines, and operated with considerable autonomy while still adhering to the theological principles established by Lorgar. This restructuring reflected the word-bearer's identity as a fundamentally religious organization rather than merely a military force. Each host functioned as both an army and a mobile temple, with daily rituals and observances considered as important as combat training. Dark Apostles were expected to be spiritual leaders first and military commanders second, with their authority derived from theological knowledge and favor with the chaos gods rather than purely martial prowess. Under this system, the traditional chaplaincy evolved into the elite echelon of the Legion. Where loyalist chaplains served as spiritual advisors to their battle brothers, word-bearers chaplains became the primary conduits through which the will of the chaos gods was interpreted. They underwent extensive theological training and ritual scarification, their bodies inscribed with passages from the Book of Lorgar that allowed them to channel warp energies more effectively than their brethren. The relationship between Erebus and Cor Pharon during this period was characterized by intense rivalry that occasionally erupted into open conflict. Both claimed to best understand Lorgar's will during his absence, and both sought to shape the Legion according to their own interpretation of the primordial truth. Their philosophical differences, though subtle to outsiders, created significant factional tensions within the Legion hierarchy. Cor Pharon, never fully Astartes due to his advanced age when receiving his enhancements, advocated for a more inclusive approach to chaos worship that incorporated mortal cultists as essential components of the Legion's structure. His philosophy emphasized quantity over quality, seeking to spread chaos worship as widely as possible through mortal proxies, while reserving the deepest mysteries for the Astartes elite. Erebus, in contrast, promoted a more purist doctrine that prioritized the ascension of Astartes through direct communion with chaos. His approach favored intensive cultivation of fewer, more powerful servants rather than mass conversion. Under his guidance, the Legion developed increasingly elaborate rituals of possession and demonic binding, refining the techniques first developed with the Gal Vorbak during the Heresy. These philosophical differences manifested in divergent operational approaches. Hosts aligned with Cor Pharon typically operated through extensive cultist networks, using mortal worshippers to infiltrate imperial worlds and prepare them for invasion. Erebus-aligned hosts preferred direct assault supported by summoned demonic entities, focusing on ritual preparation that would thin the veil between real space and the warp at their chosen targets. Despite these internal divisions, the word-bearers maintained greater cohesion than many other traitor legions during the long millennia following the Heresy. While the Night Lords fractured into competing warbands and the Emperor's children dissolved into hedonistic pursuits, the 17th Legion retained its organizational structure and sense of shared purpose. This cohesion stemmed from their unifying theological framework. Regardless of factional alignment, all word-bearers acknowledged the supremacy of chaos undivided and Lorgar's role as its primary prophet. The Legion's activities during the 10 millennia of Lorgar's seclusion focused primarily on spreading chaos worship throughout the Imperium. Rather than pursuing purely military objectives, word-bearers' incursions typically aimed to establish permanent cult presences that would continue corrupting imperial worlds long after the Astartes forces withdrew. This approach created a vast network of chaos cults across the galaxy, many operating undetected for centuries before revealing themselves. The methodology of these corruption operations followed patterns established during the lead-up to the Heresy. Initial infiltration would be conducted by mortal cultists or specialized Astartes operatives who identified disaffected elements within imperial society, underhive gangs, disillusioned nobility, or neglected planetary defense forces. These groups would be gradually introduced to chaos worship through seemingly benign practices that address their grievances while subtly redirecting their devotion toward the ruinous powers. As cult membership grew, the word-bearers would introduce more overtly heretical elements, including demon worship and sacrifice rituals. The most devoted cultists might receive blessings in the form of minor mutations or warp-touched abilities, creating a hierarchy of initiation that motivated continued loyalty. Only when a cult reached sufficient size and influence would the word-bearers reveal their direct involvement, typically coinciding with a planned uprising or ritual to weaken the barrier between real space and the warp. The success of this approach is evidenced by inquisitorial records, which document a significant increase in chaos cult activity throughout the Imperium during the late 41st millennium. Many of these cults, when eventually purged, were found to possess corrupted copies of the Lectitio Divinitatis, or fragments of the Book of Lorgar, demonstrating the continued influence of Lorgar's writings even during his physical absence from the galactic stage. Perhaps the most significant legacy of Lorgar's theological work was its unintended influence on the development of the imperial cult. The Lectitio Divinitatis, written during his loyal period to promote emperor worship, became the foundation for the very religious structure that now defines the Imperium. This irony, that the Imperium's state religion was created by one of its greatest traitors, represents one of the most profound contradictions in imperial history. The imperial cult and the chaos worship promoted by the word-bearers share remarkable structural similarities, despite their diametrically opposed focuses of devotion. Both emphasize unquestioning faith, ritual observance, and the transcendent nature of their respective objects of worship. Both utilize similar ceremonial frameworks, including litanies, incense, and symbolic imagery. These parallels are not coincidental, but reflect their common authorship in Lorgar's theological works. Some radical inquisitorial scholars have suggested that this similarity may represent Lorgar's most subtle and devastating attack on the Imperium. By establishing the template for emperor worship, he created a system that paradoxically prepares humans for potential conversion to chaos. The mental frameworks established by imperial religious practice, with its emphasis on submission to higher power and acceptance of mystery, can be redirected toward chaos worship with disturbing ease when properly manipulated. Throughout the millennia of Lorgar's absence, rumors occasionally emerged claiming the Daemon Primarch had been sighted leading word-bearers' forces in real space. Most such reports proved false, typically involving particularly powerful dark apostles mistaken for their gene father. However, inquisitorial records document 3 instances between the 32nd and 40th millennia where evidence suggests Lorgar may have briefly emerged from seclusion to directly intervene in galactic affairs. The most credible of these incidents occurred during the 13th Black Crusade in 999 M41, when multiple reliable witnesses reported a golden-skinned, winged figure matching Lorgar's description leading a word-bearer's assault on the shrine world of Vanaheim. The entity displayed psychic abilities far beyond those of even the most powerful dark apostles, including the capacity to transform loyal defenders into gibbering cultists with mere words. Grey Knight's forces dispatched to counter this threat found only residual warp energy by the time they arrived, the entity having departed after destroying the planet's primary cathedral complex and replacing it with a twisted warp gate. The creation of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium marked a significant turning point in Lorgar's long contemplation. As the galaxy was split by this massive warp tear, the Daemon Primarch finally emerged fully from his sanctum in the Templum Inficio. Word-bearers throughout the galaxy reported simultaneously experiencing visions of their Primarch standing before the Great Rift, arms outstretched as if in welcome, his voice echoing directly in their minds with a simple message: the work begins. This emergence coincided with a massive increase in word-bearers' activity across both sides of the Great Rift. Dark apostles who had operated independently for millennia suddenly coordinated their efforts in complex, galaxy-spanning campaigns that demonstrated a unified strategic vision. Chaos cult uprisings erupted simultaneously on thousands of worlds, many following identical ritual patterns despite having no apparent connection to each other. These developments strongly suggested the direct influence of a single coordinating intelligence, with the capacity to communicate through the warp across vast distances. Perhaps most significant was Lorgar's renewed conflict with his loyalist brother, Corvus Corax, the Raven Guard Primarch, who had spent the millennia since the heresy hunting traitor forces within the warp encountered Lorgar in the shifting non-reality of that realm shortly after the formation of the Great Rift. Their confrontation, witnessed by agents of both the Inquisition and the Word-Bearers who had been drawn into the warp through separate circumstances, demonstrated how far both Primarchs had evolved beyond their original forms. Lorgar appeared as a golden-skinned colossus whose form continuously shifted between material solidity and warp energy translucence. Corax had become something equally transformed, a creature of shadow and razor that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Their battle transcended physical combat, manifesting as reality-warping confrontation where concepts and beliefs clashed alongside physical blows. The outcome of this conflict remains unknown, as the witnessing parties were forced to flee when the battle's intensity began tearing apart the already tenuous reality of their location in the warp. What is clear is that both Primarchs survived the encounter and continue their opposing missions, Lorgar spreading the worship of chaos, Corax hunting those who betrayed the Emperor's vision. As the Imperium enters the era Indomitus, with the returned Guilliman leading a desperate effort to hold humanity's realm together, Lorgar's long contemplation appears to have reached its conclusion. Word-Bearer's activity has increased exponentially, with coordinated attacks striking vulnerable Imperial worlds across the galaxy. Dark Apostles speak with renewed certainty about the final conversion that will transform humanity into willing servants of chaos. After 10,000 years of preparation and theological refinement, Lorgar Aurelian has emerged from his sanctuary with a fully developed vision for humanity's future under chaos. Whether this vision will triumph over the resurgent Imperium remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. The golden-tongued Primarch who once built cathedrals to the Emperor now leads a dark crusade to topple everything his father built, replacing it with a new order where humanity embraces the primordial truth he discovered in the ashes of his shattered faith. The Word-Bearer's legacy thus stands as perhaps the most profound of any Primarch, not measured in worlds conquered or enemies slain, but in souls corrupted and faiths twisted. From the Lectitio Divinitatis to the Book of Lorgar, from the Imperial cult to the countless chaos cults festering across the galaxy, his influence shapes the fundamental spiritual landscape of humanity 10 millennia after his betrayal. In this, perhaps, he has achieved the immortality he once sought through devotion to the Emperor, ensuring that regardless of the outcome of the material conflict between chaos and the Imperium, the battle for humanity's soul will forever be fought on terms that he defined.